All right, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you yet again. Ideally, we are going to do a new chapter for today, which is going to be evaluating arguments and truth claims. This is going to be a continuation of what we did the last few sessions, whereby we discuss on what arguments are, we define what arguments are. So basically, um, arguments will be a combination of two things, um, conclusion plus premise. And when you have this combination of these two, then it comes to the idea of an argument. So it can be either one premise or it can be more than one premise. It's up to you really, but you need to have only one conclusion in one piece of argument. All right. So today we are going to look into the idea of how we are going to evaluate arguments and how we are going to define arguments as in good arguments or acceptable arguments. All right. So let's go to the next slide. Once you have an argument summarized, you need to evaluate it to see if you are forced to accept the conclusion. So when we have an argument in front of us, or when someone argues something and you're listening to it, you have to look into the concept of whether you can accept the conclusion as in the premises are pointing out towards the conclusion or not. So we have two main questions which we have to ask, which is the argument a good argument or are the premises acceptable? So when you look at these two questions, ideally it's connected to the idea of an argument itself, whereby when we look at an argument, we have two concepts yet again, conclusion plus premise. So if the premises are acceptable, then ideally the conclusion should be acceptable as well, as long as it is related to the premises being given. All right. So similarly, when we look at good arguments, that is what we are looking into. The concept of the premises being an extension of the conclusion and the premises being acceptable to the nature of the conclusion. All right, so let's carry on. Now, before we discuss further on with what is considered a good argument, we are looking into the idea of what good arguments do not mean. So there are three things which good arguments do not mean, which is agree with your view, persuasive argument, and well-written or well-spoken kind of argument. So let's go into the first one, which is good argument does not mean that it agrees with my view. Now, what does this mean? Ideally, it means that, say for example, for discussion purposes, we look into the idea of abortion. When we look into the issue of abortion, we can go into two different sides of the argument. The first one is abortion is something acceptable, or abortion is something which is not acceptable, for example, right? Now, say for example, you agree to the point of view that abortion is not acceptable, for example, right? And if someone came up with a piece of argument stating that abortion is not acceptable because of this, and this, then when you look at the piece of argument, just because this argument is in line with your view as abortion is not acceptable, therefore you are going to say that this is a good piece of argument. And this is something which should be accepted by not only you but anyone else, right? Now this is what it means by good arguments do not mean that it agrees with your view, because if someone argues to the idea that abortion might be okay and they give you valid reasons of why, and you do not agree with the view because it's not in line with whatever you think, then that is going to be dangerous, because it shows that we are being a close-minded person. And we have to remember as well, as critical thinkers, it's not a good idea for us to only consider one side of the argument and neglect the other, because good critical thinkers are thinkers who always look at both sides of the argument, and then and only then are they going to determine which one is better, which one is not. All right. So if you have only, or if you have, you agree with only one side of the argument, and whoever says that is something which is considered a good argument by you, this is also what we call belief bias. All right, belief bias. So ideally, a good argument does not mean that it agrees with your view only. All right. Now, moving on to the second one, good argument does not mean that it is persuasive by nature. So what this means is that, probably sometimes when you listen to someone speaking and they can actually persuade you to buy something, for example, right? Then you say that it is a good piece of argument. Well, ideally it's not going to be. Say for example, right, just for discussion purposes, as I mentioned before, you go to a shopping complex, right, and you are to buy a chocolate bar, for example, and this guy comes to you and says that this chocolate bar is the best chocolate bar, and they give you ideas such as the ingredients taken from this chocolate bar is um, environmental friendly, for example. And being environmental friendly is really really important because of what we are facing nowadays, which is all these dangers when it comes to heat and stuff, just for example, right? And this guy is really persuasive by nature, and you think to yourself, well, this is actually a good piece of argument. Why? Because he's actually able to persuade you to buy something. Well, ideally, good arguments does not mean that it is persuasive by nature. Say for example, the example just now, chocolate. When you say it is a good chocolate, what do you look into? What are the criteria you look into? Are the ideas of being user friendly, environmental friendly, define the idea of a good piece of chocolate, for example? Now these would be the type of questions which you are going to ask, right? So ideally people aren't always smart and can be persuaded by eloquent speeches. So if you are not able to be critical upon thinking of why this person is saying this and this, then you might be inclined into thinking that whatever the person said is a good piece of argument, for example. Okay, so going to the third one, uh, good argument does not mean that it is well written or well spoken. Now, for this one, what it means is that sometimes uh, a good user of the language might have a better ability to speak, right? And to make people understand what they are saying. Say, for example, if for us, our mother tongue is, maybe Chinese or Malay or Tamil, for example, and you have another person who's actually good in speaking English, and when they say something, it sounds really, really good and clear. But sometimes you have to bear in mind that it's not always the ability to use the language, but rather it is the content or the argument, or whether the premises supports the argument, which makes sense to a good argument. All right. So what happens here is that sometimes when a person does not or is not able to communicate well in a certain language, they are easily misunderstood as being not uh, good critical thinkers or not having good arguments, which in a way is not always true. Because when we look at the idea of good arguments, we are looking into two concepts yet again, premise and conclusion. And sometimes, even if they don't have the language, the premises and the conclusion might be really, really good. So it does not mean that if you have bad usage of the language, then you don't have a good argument. All right, vice versa. Okay, so these are the three things which at times good argument does not mean these three things. Agrees with my view, persuasive argument, and well written or well spoken argument. All right, now let's go on to the next slide. So now let's go into the idea of what a good argument really means. Now, when we look into the idea of a good argument, we are looking into the idea of two things. Number one, deductively sound. Number two, inductively cogent. So what does this mean? Now, deductively sound means all the premises points out towards the idea of the conclusion. So the premises are going to be logical reasoning, which points out towards the idea that the conclusion is something which we can accept based on the premises being given to us. Right? On the other hand, inductively cogent means that the premises would be true. And if the premises are true, then ideally the conclusion should be true as well. And if we have these two ideas, deductively sound and inductively cogent, as being, you know, valid with true premises or strong with true premises, then ideally we can say that it is going to be a good piece of argument. All right. So basically, it involves the idea of what an argument is, because we spoke about arguments, which would be premises and conclusion. So good premises which points towards the conclusion, and also true premises which points towards the conclusion, would be the criteria of a good argument. All right. Now, it will also need to be clear when we talk about an argument. It has to be clear, it has to be precise, it has to be relevant, it has to be consistent, it has to be complete, and it has to be fair. And all these criteria are also criteria which are going to point towards the idea of a good piece of argument. Why? Because you need all these 6 ideas in order for you to have a strong premise, or for you to develop strong premises in order to support the conclusion, right? You have to make sure that the premises are clear, precise, relevant, consistent, complete, and fair. And only when you have all this can you say that the premise or the premises are actually good. Okay? So in a nutshell, a good argument embodies all the good qualities of critical thinking. All right? So let's continue with the next slide. Now, these are ideally some general guidelines which is going to be something related to the idea of a good argument. All right, so we discussed this before in the previous slide, so let's look at it again. So are the premises true? Is the reasoning concrete? Is the argument deductively valid or inductively strong? So we are looking into the idea again of the premises. Are the premises pointing towards, are all the premises pointing towards the idea of the conclusion? And are all the premises true to the conclusion? All right. So does the arguer commit any logical fallacies? Fallacies would be logical arguments or reasonings, so which are faulty. All right. So logical reasonings which are faulty. Does the arguer express his or her points clearly and precisely? Are the premises relevant to the conclusion? Are the arguer's claims logically consistent, or do any of the arguer's claims contradict other claims made in the argument? So is the argument complete? Is all relevant evidence taken into account? So you're looking into it from different perspective, yeah. And the last one is the argument fair. Is the arguer fair in his or her presentation of the evidence and treatment of opposing arguments and views? So we are looking, as I mentioned before, from different perspectives, from different point of views, because ideally for you to look at any kind of issue or any kind of argument, you have to be, you have to at least consider other point of view as well, right? Okay, now let's go to the next one. All right. Now, arguments always contain premises, and while some premises will have support from other premises, there will always be premises that are mere assumptions, claim made by an argument. So if the argument is valid, strong, it is soundness. Its soundness, cogенcy will turn on whether these assumptions are true. So how can we tell if we should accept them? How can we tell that we can actually accept the premises as in true premises or correct premises or ideally reasonable premises? All right, so we have a concept of what we call the principle of rational acceptance. So it is reasonable to 3 things. Yeah, the first one is it is reasonable to accept a claim if the claim does not conflict with personal experience that we have no good reason to doubt it. Second one, the claim does not conflict with background beliefs that we have no good reason to doubt. And the third one is the claim comes from a credible source. Now we are going to go to the next slide, which is going to explain the first one, personal experience. So does the claim conflict with your personal experience? So in general, we should favor the testimony of our side over the testimony of others. So ideally, if we have a certain level of experience regarding something, right? So we are going to rely on our level of experience regarding that piece of information. Say, for example, if someone tells you that Doberman is a kind of dog, is gentle as a kitten, but you have seen this dog attacking other people, then I don't think in any way you are going to believe that a Doberman is gentle, right? There's no possible way of you doing so because it's not logical. You have seen it attack someone. So even if someone tells you that a Doberman is gentle, I don't think that's, you know, in any state of mind, someone would believe that a Doberman is gentle, right? But then we should understand that experiences are always undoubted because of some reasons. It can be mistaken as well because any kind of reason. Say for example, if you are driving a car, right? You are driving a car and it is raining and you see some kind of figure in the middle of the road, and because it's raining and you can't see, you made the assumption that it is someone in the middle of the road, but it might be wrong, it might not be accurate. Why? It's because of the conditions which are surrounding you, for example. All right, so this is just one kind of example. You know, sometimes it might be sensory impairment whereby you are exhausted from a lot of work, for example, and you can't at the moment see really well. Maybe your eyes are blurred, you know, this kind of thing. So that can be another impairment. All right, and you also have observer impairment. For example, if you are drunk, then you are driving, then you can't see the road, for example. That is observer impairment. Unreliable measuring instrument, or maybe bad memory, because you know not everyone has photogenic memories, right? So sometimes memories can make a fool out of us, you know, those kind of things. So the problem with when we talk about experience and when we talk about a claim, right, it is possible for us to accept a claim based on our level of experience, but then we have to be careful because we have to understand that sometimes our experience can be impaired as well because of reasons like what I mentioned just now. So just be aware of that sometimes you can't really rely on your experience 100%. All right, and critical thinkers do understand that because then they would doubt whatever they see, or they would doubt sometimes to their own understanding that things might not seem as it is, you know. Okay, so let's carry on. So this is an example of how reliable are your sensors. If you look at this, you know, picture over here, if you look at the lines, I believe you would agree that they are not really straight lines, right? But if you put it together, you know, put it as in a box, then it would be a straight line. It does not seem like it is a straight line because of how it is being placed. All right, the whites are not placed under the same column, is placed, you know, differently. So because of that, it does not seem like it is in a straight line, right? But it is actually in a straight line. Okay. Now let's have a look at another one. So if you look at this quote, right, just how are you supposed to count how many times R appears in this quote? So I'll give you a minute, just have a look at it. How many R's can you see? Okay, so if you say two, well, ideally, I think most of us would say two. Uh, it's not the accurate answer. It's supposed to be three. So if you notice, R in the first line and R in the second line are placed next to, you know, it's actually redundant, R, R. So you have three R's which appears here. So sometimes, you know, sometimes it's not always reliable to rely on your sense. Okay. Now, going on to the next one, does the claim conflict with your background beliefs? Now, when we say background beliefs, we can say, for example, things which are related to your culture, things which are related to your religion, things which are related to something which you are brought up to believe in, you know, since young up to this point of life, you know. So background beliefs usually assume without question that inform most of other beliefs that we have. All right, so you know, uh, when I was younger, right? When I was younger, I used to be afraid of dogs, not because a dog has ever chased me or bitten me, but because I grew up in a society whereby most of them were Malays, Muslim Malays, and according to Islam, a dog is haram. And when we say that a dog is haram, in our minds as kids, at that point I was a kid, right? It's not just haram, but it's really, really bad. Haram is really something which is bad. So I believe that dogs were really, really bad in the sense that they should not ever exist in this world. That was my belief. So every time I saw a dog, I would throw stones or sticks at them, even though they did no harm to me. So I guess that was one of the reasons why dogs would chase people. Ideally, I don't know, but that was my background belief. And background belief is something which you can actually change through sufficient evidence which is presented to you. All right, so if you have something or evidence which is presented to you and it is not in line with whatever you believe before this, then it is okay, or it is, you know, it is not wrong for you to actually change your background belief based on the evidence which has been um, placed right in front of you. So going back to the example just now, when I was growing up, so for my secondary school, I went to a school whereby we had different races in it. So I had friends from, Chinese friends, I had Indian friends, I had different other friends. So sometimes my Chinese or Indian friends would have dogs, and I would go to their houses, and from there I learned to understand that dogs are not really all that bad, because dogs are really, really good friends to humans, and if you treat them properly, then they are going to react to your treatment as being a very well trained dog, for example. So from there, I learned that dogs, although it's haram according to Islam, but it's not bad as in bad, dangerous. It does not attack you if you do nothing to it, for example, right? So that changed my understanding. That changed my background belief of the idea of dogs. All right, so let's carry on. Oh, let's look at this few questions, right? So these are actually ideas which are related to background beliefs. So sometimes, you might have a certain level of background belief, and sometimes your friends does have a different understanding when it comes to a certain idea. So if you are standing next to a friend, I mean, if you are sitting next to a friend watching this lecture, I want you guys to just have a look at all these four ideas, and I want you to discuss with your partner, or maybe if you see your partner who has watched this piece of video, and see if they have the same idea as you. And if you guys don't have the same understanding of on a certain issue, for example, like this argument, for example, then I want you to discuss, and I want you to see from his or her perspective regarding the differences of how you think. All right, so just have a look at it for a while. Okay. All right, so you can discuss with your friend later, yeah. Now let's go on to the next one, the third one. So does the claim come from a credible source? So when we want to look at a claim, and when we want to look into the idea of whether we can believe the claim or not, then it's a good idea for us to look at the source of where we got uh, the argument from. So ideally, if it comes from a genuine expert, or if it comes from someone who is really, really reliable, or from a source which is really reliable, then ideally it is something which you can trust, right? So just a simple example, like just imagine your lecturer talking about your coursework syllabus, for example, and coming to the idea of the courseworks which you have to do, right? So if you have sorry. So if your lecturer mentions that, hey, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, you have two courseworks for this course. The first one is movie analysis, the second one is a test. Then you, as a student who's sitting at your place, probably you would just accept it as it is. Why? Because the lecturer is considered an expert in that subject. Therefore, whatever he says is something which you are going to trust, right? But just imagine, yeah, if your class rep, take for example, right? Your class rep goes in front of the class. Hey guys, you know what? I read that this course will have only two courseworks, movie analysis and also a test. Now, what is going to be your response? Are you going to accept it as it is, or are you going to question your class rep as in where he got the information from, how did he get it, is the information reliable, or is the source reliable? You know, all these questions. It's probably going to go, you know, is going to be something which you are going to question, right? So that is why when the claim comes from a credible source, it is something which you would accept. But if it doesn't, then it is something which you are going to question. All right. So this is what it means that by a claim should be accepted if it comes from a credible source. All right. And I believe that is all for today's lecture. And hopefully you guys understood the whole thing. And if you don't, maybe you can ask your tutor in your tutorial classes, right? So thank you very much. Have a good day, guys. Bye.